A young hotshot thought he could embarrass Sylvester Stallone in a crowded LA restaurant. A few words turned into a challenge, and within seconds, the entire place went silent. What happened next? Let's just say by the end of the night, everyone knew one thing: you don't mess with Rocky. Subscribe for more legendary stories like this. The restaurant in Beverly Hills was buzzing, packed with celebrities, executives, and high rollers who knew that dining here was just as much about being seen as it was about the food. Sylvester Stallone sat at his table, casually dressed in a fitted black t-shirt that clung to his still powerful frame. He wasn't here for attention. He was here to enjoy a steak, maybe a glass of wine, and unwind after a long week. But the night had other plans. Across the room, a younger guy, maybe late 20s or early 30s, was getting louder with each passing drink. He was the type who thrived on making a scene, the kind who had more muscles than sense. His group of equally arrogant friends egged him on, laughing at his crude jokes and flexing for their social media posts. They were the kind of guys who walked into a place like this thinking they owned it, mistaking attention for respect. And then, the hotshot noticed Stallone. "Yo, no way. That's Stallone. That's freakin' Rocky." He nudged his friends, gesturing toward sliced table with exaggerated excitement. His buddies chuckled, and one of them lifted his phone, whispering, "Man, get a video, this is going to be good." The hotshot smirked and downed the rest of his drink, slamming the glass onto the table. The alcohol had given him a false sense of bravado, and now he had a new target for the night, one of the most iconic action stars of all time. "Hey, Rocky!" he shouted across the room. The name alone made several heads turn, some recognizing Stallone instantly, others just curious about the commotion. Stallone, in the middle of cutting into his steak, barely glanced up. He had heard it all before. Some drunk guy is looking to impress his friends, trying to get a reaction. He ignored it. That was a mistake. The hotshot took it as a challenge. He stood up, adjusting his snug designer shirt, making sure his biceps popped just right, and swaggered toward Stallone's table. His friends followed, cameras rolling. "You don't hear too good, old man," he said, his voice dripping with forced confidence. This time, Stallone slowly looked up. His expression was unreadable, calm but observant, like he was sizing up an opponent in the ring. He placed his fork and knife down, wiped his mouth with his napkin, and leaned back in his chair. "Something I can help you with?" His voice was smooth, controlled, and had no aggression, yet. The hotshot chuckled, glancing at his friends for approval before turning back to Stallone. "Yeah, actually," he said. "I was just tellin' my boys here, man, I grew up watchin' your movies. You were a beast. A real badass. But that was, what, 40 years ago? You still got anything left in the tank, or is it all Hollywood smoke and mirrors?" A hush fell over the surrounding tables. Conversations quieted. Even the waitstaff slowed down, sensing something was about to happen. Stallone's expression didn't change. He just stared at the guy for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. Then, with the slightest smirk, he said, "Why don't you sit down before you embarrass yourself?" The hotshot's friends hooted and laughed, but he didn't. His ego flared. He puffed up his chest, taking another step closer. "Embarrass myself? Man, I think you're the one living off past glory. You ain't a fighter, you're an actor. I bet I could take you right now." That did it. Stallone exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly, as if disappointed. Then he pushed his chair back and stood up. The restaurant seemed to shrink. The difference between the two men was obvious. The hotshot was big, sure, gym-trained, sculpted, but Stallone had the kind of size that came from decades of work, from building real strength. He wasn't a pretty boy lifter. He was built for war. And he was still fast. Before the hotshot could react, Stallone's hand shot up, not to punch, not to push, just to press his palm against the guy's chest. Firm. Unmoving. Like a stone wall. "Listen," Stallone said, his voice still low, still calm. "I've had this conversation 100 times, kid. And it always ends the same way. You sit down, you finish your drink, and you wake up tomorrow without regret. Or, you keep pushing, and you learn the hard way." The hotshot's face twitched. He glanced around, realizing just how many people were watching now. His friends had their phones up. If he backed down, he'd look weak. If he pushed forward, he'd risk getting humiliated. He clenched his jaw. Stallone saw it coming before it happened. The slight shift in the guy's stance, the weight moving onto his back foot, the tension in his arm. The idiot was gonna take a swing. Big mistake. The moment the hotshot's arm twitched, Stallone was already ahead of him. It was almost instinct, years of training, decades of understanding body language. Before the younger man could even think about throwing a punch, Stallone moved.
He didn't swing. He didn't shove.
He simply shifted his weight and stepped in, his shoulder tapping into the hotshot's chest just enough to make him stumble backward. It wasn't aggressive, but it was enough to remind the guy that no matter how big his muscles were, he had no idea what he was doing. The hotshot flailed for balance, caught himself, and then, there it was, the moment of hesitation. His face twisted between anger and second-guessing, his body tense but his mind suddenly aware that maybe, just maybe, he was in over his head. The entire restaurant was watching now. The tension was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. A few people had pulled out their phones, hoping to catch something viral, but Stallone wasn't giving them a show. He remained perfectly still, his hands loose at his sides, his expression unreadable. "Take a breath, kid," Stallone said, his voice even. "Think about your next move." That only made things worse. The hotshot's ego screamed at him. He'd made too much noise, drawn too much attention. If he walked away now, he'd be the guy who backed down from an old man. He could hear his friends laughing, whispering. He wasn't about to let that happen. Next move? He spat, rolling his shoulders, puffing up his chest. "Man, I ain't scared of you." No fear. That was the problem. The kid had never been humbled before. Stallone sighed. "I can see that." The hotshot took another step forward. Close. Too close. And that's when Stallone decided to end it. It happened so fast that most people in the restaurant only saw a blur of movement. 1 second, the hotshot was standing there, his fists clenched. The next, he was stumbling back, his legs giving out, his body twisting awkwardly before he hit the floor. Hard. The sound of his back smacking against the polished tile echoed through the restaurant. For a second, no one knew what had happened. No punch had been thrown. No dramatic fight had broken out. The hotshot just dropped. A few gasps. A murmur of voices. His friends were frozen, phones still raised but fingers hovering over the record button, unsure if they should keep filming or pretend they hadn't just watched their buddy get humiliated. Stallone stood exactly where he had been, completely relaxed, like he hadn't moved at all. But he had. A simple sweep, just a quick shift of his foot at the perfect angle, had taken the hotshot's legs right out from under him. No effort. No wasted movement. Just the kind of efficiency that came from decades of experience. The hotshot groaned on the ground, rolling onto his hands and knees, blinking in confusion. "What the?" Stallone crouched down, resting his forearms on his knees. "Now you're thinking about your next move, aren't you?" The restaurant held its breath. The hotshot shook his head, trying to push himself up. His face was red, his breath uneven. He still had some fight in him, but it wasn't real fight. It was frustrating. Panic. Embarrassment. "Look, kid," Stallone said, his voice low enough that only the hotshot could hear him. "You walk away now, and all that happens is a funny story at your next party. You keep pushing, it gets worse." For a moment, just a moment, there was a flicker of understanding in the hotshot's eyes. But then he clenched his teeth. His pride wouldn't let him stop. He lunged. Stallone barely moved. A subtle shift of his shoulders, a slight angle in his stance, and suddenly, the hotshot wasn't grabbing anything but air. He stumbled past Stallone and slammed chest first into a chair, knocking it over. Another wave of gasps rippled through the room. Now, it wasn't just tension in the air. It was something else. Laughter. The hotshot's face burned. Stallone turned, giving him another chance. "Are you done?" The hotshot wheezed, shoving the chair away, his fists shaking. "Screw you, old man." And there it was. The moment Stallone had seen coming since the kid first opened his mouth. He stepped forward slow and controlled, and for the first time, the hotshot flinched. That tiny movement, that instinctual fear, told Stallone everything he needed to know. The fight was over. He leaned in slightly. "You hear that?" he asked. The hotshot blinked, confused. "That silence." Stallone gestured toward the restaurant. "That's respect leaving the room." The words hit harder than any punch could. The hotshot swallowed, glancing at the faces around him. No one was cheering for him. No one was impressed. Even his own friends had taken a step back, unsure if they wanted to be seen with him anymore. He had lost. Badly. Stallone stepped away. "Go home, kid. Sleep it off." For a second, the hotshot didn't move. His breathing was uneven. His body was tight with adrenaline. But the reality had sunk in. There was no comeback from this. Slowly he turned. And then, without another word, He walked toward the exit. The restaurant was silent as the doors swung shut behind him. Stallone exhaled, shaking his head slightly, then turned back toward his table. He pulled out his chair, sat down, and picked up his fork. His steak was still warm. The restaurant, slowly, hesitantly, came back to life. Conversations resumed. Waiters moved again. But the energy had changed. People weren't just watching Stallone anymore. They were remembering why legends stayed legends. The restaurant was still buzzing from what had just happened. Conversations had restarted, but every few minutes, someone would steal a glance at Stallone, their expressions a mix of awe and amusement.
Some whispered.
Others laughed under their breath. A few of the younger guys, still gripping their drinks, sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Stallone ignored it all. He cut into his steak, took a bite, and chewed slowly, like nothing had happened. Because for him, nothing really had. This wasn't new. This wasn't surprising. It was just another moment in a long line of moments where someone with something to prove bit off more than they could chew. A waiter approached hesitantly, clearing his throat.
"Ah, sir.
Would you like another drink?" Stallone looked up and smirked. "Are you worried I'm going to throw this one too?" The waiter flushed, shaking his head. "No, no, sir, I just..." Stallone chuckled and waved it off. "Relax, kid. I'll take another." The waiter nodded quickly, turning on his heel. As he walked away, Stallone noticed something. A man 2 tables over, watching him with a different kind of stare. Not admiration. Not curiosity.
Something colder.
He was older than the hotshot, maybe early 40s. Broad-shouldered, thick arms, the kind of build that suggested he spent more time under a barbell than behind a desk. His short-cropped hair was neat, his jaw lined with just the right amount of stubble to look deliberate.
And his eyes?
They weren't just focused.
They were locked.
Stallone knew that look. It wasn't the look of a guy who had just seen something entertaining. It was the look of a guy who wanted to test himself. Stallone took another bite of his steak, pretending not to notice. But he could feel it, something was shifting in the air. The waiter returned, setting down a fresh drink.
"Here you go, sir." Stallone nodded. "Thanks."
Before the waiter could leave, another voice cut in.
"That was cute."
The tone was even, but it had weight. The kind of weight that came from experience, not ego. Stallone didn't look up immediately. He took a sip of his drink, savoring it, before slowly raising his eyes to meet the man's. The restaurant seemed to quiet again, people sensing another shift. The man leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his thick chest. "You made that kid look stupid." Stallone wiped his mouth with his napkin. "No, the kid made himself look stupid." A smirk tugged at the man's lips.
"Maybe.
"But you didn't have to embarrass him."
Stallone shrugged. "Didn't have to. Didn't have to eat this steak, either. But here we are."
The man chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. It was the kind of laugh that wasn't really a laugh at all.
"I get it," he said.
"You're still the big dog in the yard. Gotta remind people who you are." Stallone finally set his fork down. "Nah. Just have to remind people to pick their fights better." The man nodded slowly, tapping a finger against his glass. "Yeah. See, that's what I was thinking about." Stallone arched a brow.
"Oh yeah?"
The man leaned forward slightly. "Yeah. See, I don't think you remind people how to pick their fights. I think you make them want to fight you." The words hung in the air. Stallone exhaled through his nose. "And let me guess, you're one of those people?" The man's smirk widened, but it never reached his eyes. "Wouldn't mind seeing how much you really have left in the tank." The table between them felt smaller now. The air between them was heavier. This wasn't some drunk kid trying to impress his friends.
This was different.
This was a man who actually thought he had a shot. Stallone didn't answer right away. He just studied the guy, reading everything he needed to know in the way he sat, the way he held his drink, and the way his muscles twitched just slightly under his shirt. He wasn't just some random tough guy. He had training. Experience. And, more importantly, he had something to prove. Stallone took another sip of his drink, then slowly set the glass down. "You're making a mistake," he said. The man tilted his head. "Is that so?"
"Yeah," Stallone said.
"'Cause you're not that kid."
He didn't know better.
"You do.
And you're still here."
The man's jaw flexed slightly, but his smirk stayed. "Maybe I just like challenges." Stallone exhaled, running a hand through his hair.
"Listen, I get it.
You see me, you think, man, if I take down Rocky, that's a story. But here's the thing. He leaned in slightly. If you have to talk yourself into believing you can win, you've already lost. The man's fingers tightened around his glass. Stallone watched the small motion, the slight tremor of tension. He'd seen it before. He knew what it meant. A decision was about to be made. Then, the man pushed his chair back. Stallone didn't move. People were watching now. Conversations had slowed. The air felt thick again. The man stood, rolling his shoulders. His movements were smooth and practiced. He wasn't rushing, but he wasn't hesitating either. He wasn't walking away. He was committing. All right, legend, he said, cracking his neck. Let's see if you're as good as the stories. Stallone exhaled. Not because he was worried, but because he was tired. Tired of guys like this. Tired of nights like this. But it didn't matter. Because once the challenge was made, there was only one way this ended. Stallone didn't stand right away. He let the tension build, letting the man feel the weight of his own challenge. The restaurant was deathly quiet now, every eye locked on the two men. Some people were gripping their drinks a little tighter, others leaning in slightly, not wanting to miss a single detail. Finally, Stallone sighed and pushed back his chair. He stood up slowly, casually, like he had all the time in the world. He rolled his shoulders once, flexing his fingers, shaking out the stiffness in his hands. Not because he needed to, but because he knew the guy was watching. Sizing him up. Waiting for any sign of hesitation. He wouldn't get one. The man across from him smirked, shifting his weight onto his back foot. He was trying to look relaxed, but Stallone had been around too long to miss the subtle giveaway, the slight tension in his jaw, the micro-adjustments in his stance. He wasn't nervous. But he wasn't as confident as he wanted to be. Stallone let a small smirk tug at the corner of his mouth. Are you sure about this? The man cracked his knuckles. Think I'll let you find out. Stallone exhaled through his nose. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them slightly. The guy didn't back up. That was good. That was interesting. Most guys, when they picked a fight, didn't actually want one. They wanted to be stopped. Wanted someone to step in and break it up before it started. This guy? He was in it. And that meant Stallone had to take it seriously. A voice suddenly cut through the tension. Gentlemen. The restaurant manager. Short, round, sweating bullets. He wrung his hands together, eyes darting between them. Let's not do this here, all right? We got a full house. A lot of witnesses. Let's all just sit down, have a drink, and... The man with the smirk turned his head just slightly. Relax, buddy. Just a friendly conversation. The manager let out a weak laugh. Yeah, well, let's keep it that way. Stallone didn't take his eyes off the man in front of him. He studied him again, one last time. Broad shoulders. Solid build. Not just strong, controlled. This wasn't some guy who just lifted weights and took selfies. He had training. Maybe boxing. Maybe MMA. Something. And more importantly, he believed he had a chance. That was his mistake. Stallone tilted his head slightly. You want a lesson, kid? The man grinned, but his fingers flexed slightly at his sides. I want to see what's left. Stallone stepped even closer, now just a foot away. He let his voice drop, just between them. All right, he said. But don't say I didn't warn you. And then, he moved. It wasn't a punch. It wasn't a shove. It was something simpler. Faster. More effective. A quick, controlled tap, right to the guy's knee. Not enough to hurt him. Just enough to knock him slightly off balance. And that was all Stallone needed. Because in that half second where the guy instinctively adjusted, Stallone stepped in, closing the gap completely. His forearm pressed lightly against the guy's chest, not aggressive but firm. Just enough to let him know. The man's smirk faltered. Stallone's voice was calm. I'm not your fight. For a moment, the guy hesitated. Because this wasn't what he expected. He expected a swing. A shove. Something dramatic. But this? This was something else. Something worse. Control. The realization hit him like a freight train. He wasn't in control. Stallone was. The restaurant held its breath. The guy swallowed, still holding his smirk, but now it was forced. All right, legend, he murmured. I see you. Stallone nodded. Good. Now sit down. The guy hesitated a second longer, then exhaled sharply through his nose. He took a step back, hands up, a small chuckle escaping his lips. "You're all right, old man." Stallone let his smirk return.
"I know."
The restaurant slowly exhaled as the tension broke. Conversations restarted. The manager looked like he might collapse from relief. The guy gave Stallone one last look before shaking his head and turning back to his table. He picked up his drink, took a long sip, and muttered something to his buddies. Stallone sat back down,
Picked up his fork. And kept eating.
because to him, nothing had happened. And that was the part that made it worse.
For everyone else?
They'd never forget it. The restaurant started to return to normal. Conversations picked up, glasses clinked, and the low hum of laughter filled the air again. But the energy had shifted. People still stole glances at Stallone, whispering to each other and exchanging knowing looks. At his table, Stallone took another bite of his meal like nothing had happened.
Because to him, nothing had.
But across the room, the guy who had just been put in his place wasn't as relaxed. He sat back in his chair, swirling the drink in his glass, his eyes flicking towards Stallone every few seconds. His buddies weren't saying much anymore, and that was the problem. Before, they had been hyping him up, laughing along, pushing the moment forward.
Now they were quiet.
They had seen it too. And the guy hated that.
His jaw tightened.
His fingers drummed against the table. He wanted to let it go.
Really, he did.
But the truth was, guys like him didn't let things go.
They doubled down.
And right now, he was trying to figure out how. One of his friends cleared his throat.
"Man, it's not worth it." The guy didn't respond. Another buddy leaned in.
"Seriously, bro."
He made his point. Let it go.
But that was the problem. That was the exact problem. Because the only reason they were saying that? It was because they knew he had lost. And that made his blood boil. Slowly, he set his drink down.
Pushed his chair back. Stood up. His friends tensed. "Dude."
He held up a hand, stopping them.
"Relax," he said.
"Just going to say something." They didn't believe him. And neither did anyone else. Because the moment he started walking, the restaurant quieted again.
Not completely. Not yet. But just enough.
Just enough for everyone to feel it. Stallone felt it too. He sighed through his nose, taking one last bite of his food before setting his fork down.
He didn't look up. Not yet.
He just reached for his napkin, wiped his mouth, and waited. Waited for the inevitable.
And then, the guy was there.
Standing next to his table.
Silent. Waiting.
Stallone finally looked up. His expression was unreadable.
Not annoyed.
Not angry. Just observing. The guy cracked his knuckles again.
"You got lucky."
Stallone raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?"
The guy nodded once. "You caught me off guard."
Stallone exhaled, leaning back in his chair slightly. "Kid, I caught you exactly how you presented yourself." The guy's eye twitched. A few people at nearby tables went still.
The guy forced a smile. "Let's settle this."
Stallone tilted his head slightly. "We already did."
The guy shook his head. "No, not like that."
Stallone waited. The guy leaned in just slightly.
"Outside. Now."
The words weren't loud. But they were heavy. And now, the restaurant was quiet again. Stallone studied him for a long moment. He could see it now. This wasn't about proving something to Stallone anymore. This was about proving something to himself.
And that?
That was dangerous. Stallone drummed his fingers on the table for a second, then sighed. "You don't want this, kid." The guy's eyes darkened.
"I do."
Stallone wiped his hands on his napkin, then tossed it onto his plate. Slowly he stood.
He was relaxed. Casual. Not tense. Not worried.
Just moving with the kind of confidence that came from experience. Real experience. The kind you don't buy. The kind you don't fake. And the guy saw it. And he hated it. Because he knew deep down, he had already lost. But he was too far in to stop now. So he just clenched his fists. Stallone exhaled through his nose.
"All right," he said. "Let's take a walk."
And just like that, they headed for the door. The restaurant held its breath. Waited. Because everyone knew. Something was about to happen. Outside, the night was cool, the city lights flickering against the pavement. The street wasn't deserted, but the few people nearby had already noticed the shift in energy. A quiet tension lingered in the air, something unspoken yet unmistakable. Stallone stepped onto the sidewalk, rolling his shoulders casually, as if this was nothing more than another stroll. Behind him, the restaurant door swung shut, leaving a hush in its wake. Inside, diners leaned against the windows, some half standing from their seats, curiosity gripping them. The guy followed, his steps heavier, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. His jaw clenched, his mind racing. He had started this, and now he was here.
No backing down.
Stallone turned to face him, standing relaxed, weight evenly distributed, arms loose.
Not defensive. Not aggressive. Just ready.
You really want to do this? Stallone asked, his voice even, almost tired. The guy cracked his knuckles again.
Yeah.
Stallone sighed, glancing at the empty street ahead.
All right. You throw first.
The guy hesitated.
Just for a second.
And in that second, it became obvious. He had never fought someone like Stallone before. He had thrown punches at guys like him. Guys his age, guys at the gym, guys with muscles that were for show. But Stallone wasn't a guy with show muscles.
He was built different.
And the guy knew it. But his pride wouldn't let him stop.
So he threw a punch. It was fast. It was strong. But it wasn't good enough.
Stallone didn't move until the last moment. Then, with the same effortless precision he had shown inside, he leaned just enough to the side, letting the punch slip past him by an inch. It was over before it started. Before the guy could process his miss, Stallone's left hand moved, lightning fast, grabbing his wrist and twisting just slightly. Not enough to break it. Not enough to cause real damage. Just enough to let him feel it. The guy's breath hitched, his body freezing up from the pain.
And then, Stallone stepped in.
Using nothing but positioning, he turned his body and the guy's momentum against him. With a quick motion, he guided him off balance, sending him stumbling forward. The guy barely caught himself. By the time he turned around, fists raised, Stallone was already looking at him, calm as ever.
Are you done? Stallone asked.
The guy's hands shook.
He could still fight.
He could still throw another punch.
But what was the point? He knew what would happen.
Everyone knew. The tension in his arms faded. His breathing slowed. And then, without another word, he dropped his hands.
A long silence passed.
Then Stallone gave him a slow nod.
Not mocking. Not victorious. Just understanding.
The guy swallowed hard. His gaze flickered toward the restaurant windows. He saw his reflection. Saw the people watching. And for the first time, he really saw himself. Saw what he had been trying to prove. And saw that he had already lost before he even stepped outside. Stallone adjusted his watch, exhaled through his nose, and turned to walk away.
No gloating. No smugness.
Just a man who had been here before, too many times to count. The guy stayed where he was, staring at the ground. Then finally he muttered, "I was an idiot."
Stallone paused. Looked over his shoulder.
And for the first time that night, he smirked.
"Nah," he said.
"You just had to learn." Then he kept walking.
And the guy? He just stood there. Because he had.